Good morning again. I'll try to carry on from where I left off yesterday. A little bit of a cold, so when the coughing starts, it starts. I'll try better today. Anyhow, I'm not quite sure where I left off yesterday. I didn't review it when I started this now. I had a few moments between meetings. I did want to touch on the Anishinabek, Solutrean, Métis, and again, I'm Chief Zane Bell or Ninawabiskamakwa Anishinaabe, whichever you prefer. We are a clan-based matriarchal community nation. Our chief our chief matriarch, Chief Dr. Ikwa Mitchin, is also our hereditary medicine woman, but she is the leader, hereditary leader. It's interesting when we talked in the last video, if I remember, about hiding in plain sight. Her family is hidden in plain sight quite extensively, that there's predominantly no records of them. You see, in the United States and Canada, they didn't record Aboriginal births until the 1880s. I think it was 1880. Before 1885 in the U.S., they didn't record Aboriginal births. There are a few reservations in the United States that had data rolls on their community members before that, but it varied depending on where you were, etc. And since most of the Indian territory was conquered in the late 1800s, at the same time as Louis Riel was doing his thing out west, there are a lot of records that are missing. In French Canada, records were manipulated continuously by the here's the coughing starting again, manipulated by the Catholic society, where when you do genealogy, very difficult in Quebec because of the name changes that they did with Aboriginal communities. I have one grandmother that every child had a different last name and they had the same father. It was the Education Act, I don't believe, even came into effect in England until the late 1800s. So a lot of people were not literate. They couldn't read and write, and only a few people who were those people in control of governments, etc., institutions, would decide what they want to do with respect to recording actual information. One of the tricks in genealogy in French Canada is when you're looking at the marriage certificate, you look to see 6 weeks before you usually have a baptism. And in those cases, it's usually that the woman was Aboriginal, was baptized 6 weeks before the marriage ceremonies, roughly. So it's called reading of the banns, posting the banns, so that they actually could get married in a Catholic church. So they had to be baptized. So there's a lot of French Canadian genealogists are perplexed by this, because it says that they were a French Canadian descent, but in actuality, if you're French Canadian, you're baptized when you're born. You don't wait until 6 weeks before you get married. So you have to look at genealogy very, very, very carefully, because there's a lot of misrepresentation, even those very extensive records of French Canada in regards to the peopling of New France. The other issue with respect to who's a Métis in Canada is the fact that in the capitulation of Quebec in Montreal in 1763, and after the Treaty of Paris for that, England won a war in France, gave France back to France if they gave the Britain the colonial trade colony along the St. Lawrence. But the one condition of the surrender is all the full-blooded Frenchmen and women had to burn their flags and go back to France. But they had, I think, 6 months or a year to resolve their issues. The only persons that are allowed to stay in New France were those who are already married into the Aboriginal community. And just off the top of my head, I think the population estimate of those who were left in New France was around 58,000, and every one of those 58,000 were already integrated into the native community. And Champlain said back in the, I think it was the late 1500s, it might have been at the beginning of the 1600s, he stated, I didn't pop that up just now, to research it, but he said that there will be a new race of people in North America. It will be the natives with the French, and that is the first coining of that mixed race identifier. Of course, there's all kinds of identifiers of Métis, burn sticks, run of the woods, coeur de bois, voyageur, le bastard canadien, which was a favorite phrase of the American fur traders, le bastard canadien. And the word Canadien was actually a derogatory word for the Métis. So if you look at the population of Canada right now and the French Canadians here, well, they didn't allow French immigration back into the colony of the Dominion of Canada until 1885, I believe, when they started to open up the possibility for you to come from France back to New France. So there was an isolation of the French colony with its roots in France. Had René Lévesque, actually a family community member, who has obviously passed, gone to the Western Gate. If he had said in the referendum in that period when he was in power that instead of Québécois they were Métis, he may have won the separation of Quebec from the Dominion of Canada. So there, like I said, when you go into the internet and you start pulling out all these little pieces of misinformation and information, the story is really amazingly different than what you would assume. So I guess what I was alluding to, that most of the people in Quebec who can trace their ancestry before 1763 in New France, they're actually 99% possibility that they're of native blood. Now, in our culture, which was upheld in the Delgamuukw case, I think section 147, Aboriginal customs and traditions are equal to law. As I referred to in the previous video, in the Indian Act, adult adoptions are legal. So in Canadian law, as a precedent, adult adoptions of a colonial to an Aboriginal community are legal, and those people get their status card. And if you look at the history of how the Indian Act was made, the Gradual Civilization Act, the Enfranchisement Act, the Indian Act, it was over time to erode the rights of Indigenous people. If you look at the Haudenosaunee, it come over after the War of 1812, and they were friends, and the American Revolution, they were friends of the Crown. They were supposed to be a separate nation, but they got sucked into the Indian Act and all their rights are eroded. So when you look at Indigenous rights, you have to look at all the different communities, bands, tribes. I have a beautiful map that was created, a reproduction of a map was created in just after the late 1700s, after the British rule came into New France. And they identify all these different bands across Ontario and Quebec. And you could see over time, they kept on changing the names of the communities. So, you know, we like to identify ourselves as Anishinabek people. We may have communities which are different First Nations based or bands under the Indian Act communities, but we're all the same people. We're all the same people. And what most important in Aboriginal customs and traditions of which clan you belong to, because the clan is that genetic family. You're not supposed to marry into your clan. And in most, if not all, I think there was only 2 or 3 Aboriginal communities in North America that actually were patriarch, and there was a few that are patriarchal matriarch on the West Coast, which had hereditary, basically kings and queens, or Gichigimikwas, or Gichigimas, right? Or different names for that translate the king and queen, right? So each community that is current has different communal customs and traditions, and some of them are similar and some are different. There's a lot of linguistic variations between all the different Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and other tribes across North America, but generally we have a similar historic background, historic spirituality going back to time immemorial. You know, the creation stories are all relatively similar in North America. The other concept that most people, I hate to put it this way, but it's the I don't want to say something politically incorrect, but the film industry of Hollywood, dark-skinned Aboriginals, right? Well, the Eastern Seaboard had trees that were 6 and 12 foot in diameter, and Native people would really never see the sun, and they had a great admixture from Europe. Of course, that's in dispute, but a great admixture from Europe, from some say all the way from the Phoenicians to the Romans, to the Basque, the Vikings. Well, I would expect just people being people. You know, there was a lot of interbreeding all the way back to the 1400s from coming over here to get the resources of North America. So a lot of our people are not dark-skinned. And a lot of people don't know that in the genetics, albino people, which are in all races across the world, if race is actually a word, North American Aboriginals, and especially in New Mexico, in that area with the Hopi and the Zuni, and there is 1 in 3 have one of the 3 Aboriginal, albino genetics. And in North American Aboriginals to begin with, or Indigenous people, it's 1 in 3,500 have one of the albino genetics. In other races around the world, it's in the 300,000s that they have one of the 3 recessive albino genes. So when we have a tendency to lose our color when we intermix with other races. Sometimes we don't, sometimes we do. In my family and the clan mother's family, we carry some of those albino genetics. So we have coloration loss as we get older. And this is quite common in a lot of our Métis communities. They say in genetics that your children can't be any darker than the 2 parents. But we have a lot of Métis community members where their children, some of their children are a lot lighter, and some of them are darker than the parents. And that's the really complex issue of genetics now. And this whole new science of genetics is going to be really interesting about who was what and where you came from. But that's a whole other video discussion. So I just want to close off there, and I'll start doing some more videos to explain who we are and where we're going. This is the previous video, and this one is just a off the cuff, off my head, kind of introduction to a very complex issue that we can discuss in length if we all want to hear my ramblings. Okay, you have a great day. I'm going to start coughing again, I think.